Hi, welcome to the Institute for Small Islands. And before I welcome our guest, I would like to just acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of formerly named Arawak and Carib, but Taino and Kalingo. And I think you're going to have to help me here, Mr. Borrero, in the future. And the Kono Arawak, yes? Yes. So yes. I would like to introduce Mr. Roberto Múkaro Borrero, and welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I just want to introduce Mr. Borrero, give you a little brief summary about his many achievements. Mr. Borrero has a distinguished and diverse background in policy and program development and human rights advocacy, including specialization on the rights of Indigenous people. He retains over 25 years of experience actively engaging the United Nations system in thematic areas such as sustainable development, climate change, the Information Society, the Organization of American States, among others. He has served on the staff of the International Indian Treaty Council and the American Museum of Natural History, as well as an independent contracting consultant for UNESCO, UNDP, PBS, and other notable institutions. A published author, an accomplished artist, and a musician, Mr. Borrero is a member of the Taino Tribal Nation, an indigenous peoples whose traditional homelands extend through the Greater Antilles to the southern tip of Florida, in the US, and in 2012, he was traditionally sectioned as a kasike, a chief of the Guainía, can you pronounce that for me? I'm terribly sorry. Guainía Taíno tribal community. He has an educational background in communications and cultural studies, and in 2013, Mr. Borrero was awarded an honorary doctorate degree, philosophy in humanities from Guainía International University, Kampala, Uganda. Welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Again, happy to be here. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today.
Thank you. So can I just ask, first and foremost, can you break down the term Taino for our viewers? Because this is a very loaded term, please. It's a lot of history there.
Yeah, sure. Right. First, I'll just say, Taigwe di tunokena da tia ono, diri mukaro agwebana, horiken taino daka, koi daka. Just greeting you in the Taino language, and greeting you as sisters and brothers, sharing again my name, that I'm known in the community, Múkaro Agwebana, besides the name that you know me with in our common language, Roberto Borrero, and also identifying as you did the home island where my family comes from, which is the island of Boriking, which today is known as Puerto Rico. So yes, I identify myself as a Taino person. I'm a part of the Taino community. We are an indigenous peoples of the Caribbean region. But our homelands even extend into the southern tip of Florida in the U.S., which we call Bimini, is one of the words that we call it. Another word that our ancestors use is Cautio, and so we were well aware of those lands. According to the historical sources, there was a community of our folks living near the Calusa people, and these days we do not have a land base in Florida like other indigenous communities, but it's really the case throughout the Caribbean, and that's part of the legacy of colonization. So Taino, as a term, there's a lot of confusion on identity. As peoples coming from nations, right? Whether we talk about it in the modern sense, we know about nation states, we know about the Treaty of Westphalia and how Europe rose to power and things like that. and why certain nations are involved, for example, in the United Nations. However, the way our communities came together, we were already coming together as peoples, communities, long before European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. So, even though with that in mind, our people uh, did not identify themselves in kind of nationalistic terms. Um, in those terminologies, like we would say Trinidadian or Puerto Rican, that these are have to do with nation state. They were more identified with communities, extended relations, um, linguistic relations, cultural relations, and extending that family relationship um, in those ways. So we were definitely peoples, as the United Nations Charter says, we the peoples, and which is why indigenous peoples, when we went to the United Nations, um, we asked to be peoples with an S at the end, not just people, because we were also identifying our political realm, right? And we were also asking to be understood in the same way that other small nation states were able to rise and attain their self-determinations after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Many smaller countries developed. So it lends the question is why then, if our folks have language, our folks have culture, and all these other things that make up nations in the modern sense, why are we not considered nations? And of course, that goes into, again, links back to colonialism and paternalism and racism and all the other isms that are linked uh, with our history. So Taino is a way; it's a self-identification. It's talking about right relationship, really. It's the combination of two concepts. There's the tai, is this concept of goodness, but not the linear goodness where you have good on one side and evil on the other side, like in Judeo Christian concepts. It's more of a goodness when you're talking about right action. In other words, what are you doing for the community? How are you relating to the community? Are you causing harm to the community, or are your actions benefiting the community? And this is what we call about right relationship. Is there reciprocity in your actions? Is there, there's a lot of things that make that up. Is your foundational relationship based on respect, right? All of these things make up who we are as Taino people.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words,
already you see the disjunct right there with the two. Yes.
yes, exactly. So, in this way of self-description, there was at least two occasions where Spaniards were engaged with indigenous islanders in the Caribbean, where they used that term as a self-descriptive term, Taino. And again, the term brings together Tai in that goodness, that right action goodness, and the suffix no, meaning, as you can see in some other languages, you mentioned Lokono and others, that no is a concept of peoples, right? So when you tie those two concepts together, good people, meaning that when they met these Spaniards, they were saying, are you good people like us? Are you like us in that way? And so, it's certainly legitimate to identify ourselves as Taino if we use that understanding. It does not mean that our peoples also, no matter in the different islands wherever they came from, might have also had other ways of identifying themselves, where they might have called themselves something more specific to a place name or something of a physical attribute of the environment, maybe the people of something of the the high lake or the waterfall, or whatever this description might be wherever they lived. But being Taino was also part of that identification. So today, because that terminology was used in that early period as self-identification, we've extended that as descendants of those peoples to our concept of self-determination, right? And so in that concept, we use that term as a unifying term because it was used in more than one island as a way for people to identify themselves. So, it makes sense to us that the related peoples who have that similar culture, language, etc., can connect to each other through that way of thinking, through that Taino lens, and come together using that term. So it's perfectly legitimate. Now there's some scholars, non-indigenous, and even some recent kind of hobbyists or folks who are just coming into their awareness about their heritage who have called into question the use of the term, but it's really based in if you look at it historically, the term itself is rooted in the language, in the indigenous language, if not only the one that was spoken in the larger Caribbean islands, but also in our relational languages, like among the Lokono Arawaks of Guyana and Suriname. We can tie that term and concept and link it even down to those groups, because our languages and our cultures were related from that top of South America all the way through the islands. We had similar languages and dialects where our people could communicate. So it's not to say that every communication form or every language there was the same, or you could, or were mutually intelligible, right? It's like saying our languages come from a root, and scholars now identify that root as Arawak or Arawakan, right? But even Arawak was not a term that the people called themselves. So this is the other thing about identification. Arawak was a term that some of the English folks heard another tribe describe those people who call themselves Lokono or other self-identifications. They call them Arawak. And so that terminology was then placed on all the related folks who spoke those languages. But so you have to think about Arawak in the same way that you would think about Latin as a concept. So Latin is a base root of the Romance languages: Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese. And so there are, for example, people speak Portuguese and Spanish and Italian, probably can understand each other. Every word is not the same. It's not the same language, but you could tell it comes from, somewhere the same in way back. And it's the same for French, right? So you can see some of those connections to the language. And it's the same as Arawak through the islands. There was various dialects, and even some where they were influenced by other languages. With Taino, in the larger islands in particular, we also have an early influx of people coming over from Central America, right? And so that early influx of people coming over from Central America, Mayas, also helped shape who were those people that unfortunately Columbus met, right? In
moments,
But right, so that put us a little bit different, and put our worldview, some of our stories, and the language a bit different from if we go all the way back down to the mainland, to the Lokono, which is why we share many words, but some words are just totally different. And you have to think about the Caribbean, even back then, much like it is now. It's a place where people were coming, going, trading, visiting, some staying longer, some not. It was always a hub of trade throughout all those islands. There was vast networks. Some of our ancestors built canoa or canoes, where you get the word canoe from our language. Those canoes could hold people, that as many as 150 people, that they were recorded by the Spaniards, that they saw some of these canoas. So you can imagine.
I didn't realize they were that big.
Some of them were, yeah. I mean, many of them were not. But yes, the Spaniards recorded canoes that could hold up to 150 people at least. And so you could imagine that the size of the trees in those days, the things that were going on.
Whoa, wait, stop. That just, wow. Yeah, the size of the trees, they weren't cut down. Oh, God. Oh, that hurts. it's so interesting to hear this because, you know, I've done my research, but to hear it strung together like that in, you know, in one go, because obviously you've been researching for however many decades. And you know, when you're growing up in an island and you open your history book in school and you read, you know, point of encounter, that's the first point. You know, Columbus came in 1942. He met these Caribs who were munching their way up the archipelago, chasing the peaceful Arawaks because they were cannibals, and so they were eating the Arawaks. And, you know, that's what I was taught as a child. So I had to go out and get all of this, but it's all in bits and pieces. So to hear it strung together like this is just beautiful. I actually have goosebumps right now. Can you tell me more about the communities that Columbus would have met at that moment when he touched down? What was going on in that? It's a perfect little circle right there. Central America, there's the archipelago, there's that whole arc of the continent. Can you tell me a little bit more?
Yeah,
you were telling me about the trade.
Yeah, but you know, if you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to touch upon your school experience, because I think that that's a starting point for so many. And I think it will lead into what this other question. But this whole idea of Caribs, quote unquote, eating their way up into the Antilles, you know, that's part of the colonization process, right? In other words, that they needed to set up right away a good Indian and a bad Indian, right? Oftentimes, the good Indians were the one who converted easily to, you know, Christianity and followed the rules and became those subjects and the loyal subjects of the crowns and the church. And you know, these evil Caribs represented any form of resistance to that, right? Because you know, from the very beginning in their touchdown in the islands, you know, they needed to figure out a way to justify enslaving people, right? Remember, when we talk about the Middle Passage, you know, we have to recall that the Caribbean is where this started, right? And that the very first people who were enslaved by Columbus were indigenous peoples, were Taíno, quote unquote Caribs, island Caribs.
Encomiendas, yes.
Well, yes, all of that, and taken back to Spain right away, a bunch, you know.
The first Middle Passage.
In the very early, right. And so, yeah, going back over there. And so, you know, when we think about those things, there was some outcry, at least in the mid 1500s, about that institution. And so they had what they called the law of the Indies that was passed by the king and queen, which said basically that, you know, you couldn't enslave these people anymore unless they were sodomites, cannibals, and that. So it opened the door to anybody who was resisting colonialism could be identified as a cannibal or a Carib, right? And then it was legitimate to enslave them. So, you know, it linked resistance to war on the church, to you know, to not following authority. So the good Indian and the bad, and actually,
to demons,
you know, those who are called Carib, yes, right, exactly. So if you talk about those communities that our people had at the time of the arrival of the, you know, then emerging, you know, there weren't even Europeans yet. People don't even realize. They think of, oh, Columbus came from Spain, but it even wasn't a real Spain yet.
They weren't. You know, they were poor. They built their wealth. Sorry, I don't want to take your. Please, you go ahead. You're telling them
no. You're absolutely right. But they built their wealth on the looting and snacking of the Western Hemisphere, and that had to do with removing indigenous peoples from our lands, you know, in outright genocide or enslaving us, and then the enslavement of Africans, right, who were brought over also to work in these newly taken over lands and territories. So, you know, it was a result of that boom, that all that wealth going back to the Caribbean, to what would become Europe, really made it what it was and solidified that whole nation state, you know, the emerging ideology where these countries existed. But our folks were trading with each other. As I said, some of those canoes could hold large amounts of people. The language, and we know that people were going back and forth, is because the language was found across all those islands. In other words,
Yeah.
people like early Spanish chroniclers, like Bartolome de las Casas,
Mhm.
was one of those who came to the New World as a soldier, as a mercenary. He had an encomienda, but he renounced those things and became the first bishop ordained in the New World. And he wrote a series of publications that really highlighted the brutality and just the viciousness of the colonization at that time. And so, the folks that Columbus would have met were all interchanging, right? They were interchanging culture, language, and even those folks who are identified as Carib are really a part of our family group because our folks intermarried. There's this theory, or there's this what's said out there is that all these Caribs came and they stole the women, and then the women spoke the Taino language, and then they spoke the Carib language, and all this stuff. Upon blowing the dust away and really researching the languages, you could really see that that's not really the case. Migrations into the Caribbean happened, in various stages and at various times over hundreds and hundreds of years, and this was before the arrival of those Europeans. And so there was a lot of interchange, but there's no mistaking that the folks who had that similar language, that Arawak language group, were probably the largest populations of folks there, the largest communities. So that's why folks that were in the Bahamas, which is where Columbus first actually landed, in those islands there, they were able to speak a similar language as the ones who were in now what we call the Dominican Republic and Haiti, Puerto Rico. There because there was already interchange, and our folks were were connected. There was a recent archaeological discovery in the Bahamas that showed that they found some bones from that before colonization period, that prehistory BC, before Columbus, and they found some bones in a cave. They did some studies on those bones, and they found DNA in those bones were linked to people descendants in Puerto Rico. So, this is the Bahamas and Puerto Rico. So that shows you that our folks were already connected. And again, this just shows you that we were a maritime people, we were a trading people, as well as really intelligent agriculturalists. We were able to feed large communities in those larger islands. And the Spaniards knew this, but they weren't really looking for food; they were looking for gold, right? So this is why they wanted to subjugate us. But so you had a lot of vibrant communities, each with local leadership. There was regional leadership in these places where there was like territorial leadership, and that would go on. And all these things were talked about by the chroniclers, some of the chroniclers who came along with Columbus. When I say chroniclers, this means that these were folks in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. You would have folks like Las Casas, Oviedo, Colon himself with his diaries, Columbus. In some of the English-speaking countries, maybe you would have Rochefort or others who came to the region, Drake, Francis Drake, and others who came to the region, but they actually did some note taking and actually wrote down some of what they were witnessing as customs, things that went on. And interesting, a lot of other ways that we get information is really through courts, right? Land battles and people trying to exert power over the encomiendas and things like that. But there was a lot of witnessing to go on at that time, and some of that was captured. Not all of it, not all the nuances, perhaps, because they really weren't interested in nuances. But there were folks who recorded a lot of things, and so these vibrant communities who were blessed to live in lands in these islands that have an average year-round temperature of about 80 degrees, depending on what's going on, a year-round growing system, 2 seasons, sun and rain. We had
Coming
the
from the European
ability
has been
to
so confused.
provide. Right, so different from Europe, in
Yeah.
many ways, from the dry Iberia and other places. So, there was just a lot of culture clash right in the beginning. They didn't understand how women had a voice in the communities when they were not from cultures that really, even with the queen, that had, women who could really be vocal and assertive in their communities, even such that a few communities also had women as chiefs, right? And so, this is something that was very different
Well, there was
from what
equality
we used to.
between men and women.
Yes, there was a more of a balance, right? And I think that that's the beauty of Taino culture, is that it really tried to achieve balance in many things. So people just didn't work for the sake of work; they worked for the sake of the community. But they also were engaged in arts, right? They had aretos, so they had songs, they had poetry, they had instruments, they had that. I mean, literal artworks. If you've seen some of the Taino art, the sculptures in stone,
Stunning.
wood, the geometric design that's really about sacred geometry and all of that connecting in those ways, it really is on par with anybody else's artwork. At least I think, and I'm probably a little biased in that way, but I find it all very beautiful. But there were you look at some of these stone sculptures that our ancestors created, and you're still trying to figure out how they did that without any modern tools, how they could get it smooth and all of that. It's just lots of patience, right? So,
Probably
that's another thing that we don't have.
Probably like over years, like many people working on it, a family working on something, that kind of thing.
And I tell you, it builds when you have to have that kind of patience. It builds much more appreciation for the works, and so the works are valued, and the work of artists were valued much more so than they are now. Now is almost like you have to be really a fortunate star to be appreciated in your art oftentimes. But I think the arts and culture, being able to sing, to dance, all those things were a part of the culture. So it wasn't just about work and work for work's sake, but that all of this was going on. So these were not lazy people, as oftentimes people like to think, oh, they were backward.
No, they lived in paradise. They didn't have to work.
They brought that culture, right? Civilization. When we had our own form of and way of looking at what is a civilization. And I could tell you that our people really expanded across those islands, not through warfare, but through diplomacy and negotiation and being able to set up things with others. Those were the high values, the attributes that were really seen and wanted in leadership, not just people who can cause damage to others, because at some point as islanders you have to interchange with these other people, so it's better to have them have a good relationship than a tense one. And so we had our own forms of governance, we had our own forms of conflict resolution. All these things were in our culture, so we didn't gain much from those early encounters, except a lot of pain, the Bible, and loss of land.
Well, when you think about it, the concept of international law as we know it, and diplomacy and treaties, really did come from our hemisphere. When you think about the Haudenosaunee, when you think about our Taino system of government already existing that you're describing to us, yes, of course, there are going to be arguments, fights, scuffles with neighbors, territory wars, of course, but at the same time, there was a deep respect, and not just for this plane of existence, but for future planes, for future generations to come, and that's another deeply held function of international law, future generations,
That's right. And we see that now. Mainstream culture is now really coming back to a lot of these values and systems, trying to access them that our people originally held. And if they would have just listened to us from back then, the world might be in a different place than it is now. But again, they weren't ready to listen. They didn't come to plant beans or anything. They came for gold. They came to make themselves wealthy and go back as wealthy people.
And then tie the pound to that gold. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. I was just going to say that when you mentioned the treaty, the first international treaty between indigenous peoples and those coming over from Europe took place in the Caribbean islands, and that was with Cacique or Chief Guaracuya in the Dominican Republic. And that was the first understanding, and they actually had and got land because of that. And some of those descendants were paid even late into the 19th and 20th century, still were identified as those descendants. But you know, yeah, whatever other questions you have, I'd be happy to try to answer them. As you could see, it's not a lot of this talk is not just a yes or no or quick. There's a lot to unpack here. The conversation is complicated, and you know, like we say with the values, the UN is talking about sustainable development goals, about, you know, how do we come into right relationship with the environment. You know, that's the nature-based solutions that people are pushing now, and really our folks were already dealing with that. And it's not just a nature-based, you know, it's about having a relationship with the world around you, with all the nations, the fish nations, the animal nations, the spiritual
Not
energies,
stocks.
the plant nations, right? You know, just
Mm-hmm.
not just people, just really having that respect for all of creation.
And when you think about, you know, even thinking of something like the fish nations versus stocks, you know, in fishing conventions, they're called stocks. They're not even considered creatures in their own right. Okay, we have less than 6 minutes. What we're going to do is we're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back and we'll talk to you. So let's